Before I go into the nitty-gritty of the story, I do need to share some information for context. One of my brothers had gotten into the drug world, just skimming the surface, I'd say, and ended up in jail and recently being released again. Traffic fines with some drug possession charges. Needless to say, he knows a fair few users and pushers, and hence introduced the more respectable ones to some of the family. One of these guys is called Paul. Paul is a fairly harmless guy, and has been in and out of clinics in a bid to get control of his life back. His drug of choice, crack. He's had a pretty severe drug habit since he was a teen. When he first met my brother, and while they weren't always friends, they'd recently reconnected when Paul moved back to town to be closer to his family after getting clean again. Like I said, he's nice enough when he's not using, and since most of his family are also drug users, he didn't want to stay with them since he wanted to try and stay clean. So, Mom offered to let him stay in the spare bedroom, which isn't that weird since we've had various family friends stay over for months at a time here. So, we're fairly used to having people come in and out of our lives. Around that time, a friend who had left town straight out of high school came back for a visit, staying in the next town over. She decided to hold a get-together for a bunch of us, since this was one of those "you're gonna be trapped here for life" rural areas. So, a fair amount of people from school were still here when we were younger. There was a big rivalry between 3 of the bigger towns in the area, and most of the partygoers were coming from my town. It's changed a lot, but back then, there were a lot of fights and tension between the teens of the town. Of course, I needed a lift out of the town in question because the car was being used, so Paul offered to give one since he was a friend and was heading out that way anyway. I got the lift. Everything worked out well, and the party went off without a hitch, ending at about 1 a.m. And as we're adults now, no partying all night. We had a few people who didn't want to leave, but eventually, we crashed for the night and all seemed well. At about 4 a.m., I am a light sleeper, but even if I hadn't been, the banging on the front door probably would have awoken me. Anyway, my friend rushed out of her room and went to open the door, thinking it might be one of the partygoers returning for something. But I stopped her, and we instead turned on the porch light and peeked through the lounge window to see what was going on. The lounge room juts forward just a bit from the door, and has windows facing in towards it, so we could see the area fairly well, especially with the lights on. There was a guy and 2 girls frantically banging on the door. The guy had long, messy hair and really baggy clothes. The 2 girls looked like they were more dressed up to party, one of them in a miniskirt and bra. She seemed to have lost her shirt somewhere, and the other in a short black dress and really tall heels. Neither of us recognized them, though we had a few people come to the party who were friends of friends. The weird thing, and this was the reason it was most suspicious, was that there were no other sounds. As in, they weren't calling for us to open the door or help or anything, just pounding on the door over and over. That seemed really strange to me since you'd expect that if they were party guests, they'd be calling out to us by name or at least trying to explain through the door. I kind of put my friend into getting the phone and making a call to the cops about 5 minutes later. And then a car's headlights shone on them as I was keeping a watch through the window. They hadn't even noticed me yet. They were just banging. As a vehicle pulled into the driveway, out of the driver's side came Paul. He ducked back and pulled something out, which was a crowbar, then started screaming at them to get the hell out of there or he'd beat them. They definitely took note of that because they all kind of lurched back and started laughing. It was the first vocal sound they'd made the entire time. After a good 15 minutes of pounding, it was a really weird laughter too, hyena-like and really discontent. I can't really describe it, but it sends chills down my spine. And I watched Paul take a step back when it started. I think that they caught him off guard and it creeped him out. He kept yelling at them to move, and they eventually began leaving, except they didn't run or anything. They just turned and walked off, as if they hadn't just been pounding on someone's door or had a weird laughing fit. Paul stood there for a while watching them before coming to the door, and we let him in. He was mumbling about crackheads and junkies, but he seemed very shaken. My friend was still on the phone, waiting for the cops to show up, and when they did, they took our statements, and then did a sweep of the neighborhood. They said they'd have a car go by every now and then, but that they couldn't really do anything more than that. At that point, Paul ended up staying in the spare room, and my friend and I went back to our beds, though I didn't really sleep well for the rest of the night. In the morning, I caught a ride home with Paul, my friend coming along since she wanted to visit another friend, and we chatted about the party and what happened, kind of talking ourselves into thinking it was just a dumb prank by someone's friends. Paul didn't really say much about it and kept quiet for the whole ride back. I never heard anything about it again, and frankly, since it was in another town, I didn't care too much about it. Like I said, we'd kind of rewritten it in our minds as some kids having a prank after drinking too much. A bit of a scare, sure, but nothing dangerous. So, flash forward to a week ago when Bro comes back from jail. Paul has since moved out of the house. He'd slipped back into drugs during the time, as my mom is big against any kind of drugs and won't allow them on the property, but returned to town again a few months ago after a clinic stay. Anyway, he and my bro were talking in the play shed. It has a small campfire and is used for hosting visits and playing cards. And I had come in with popcorn to share when we got talking about dumb stuff that happened at parties. I was telling my brother about the fight we had with the hyena people and laughing about them when Paul told me that we were very lucky that night for several reasons. Apparently, when he was younger, he used to run with a group who would invade homes for fun. They'd take their drug of choice, get smashed, pick a house to terrorize, and a few people would open the doors, and when that happened, they'd rush in, attack the householder, whoever opened the door, and grab whatever they could and leave. However, they were kind of dumb, smart, paranoid. The lack of talking was because if someone figured out their voices, they'd be able to identify the attacker. So, they decided not to speak at all during the invasion. They'd just bang over and over again until they got attention. If no one opened up after a while, they'd just walk away to make it seem like a prank. No voice identification meant that no one would get caught since it'd be too dark to see their faces. Paul said he'd gone to see a nobody that night, and he had had a few friends over. They talked about how dumb they were as kids, doing these home invasions, and how lucky they've been that they never got caught or seriously hurt anyone. Some of the younger ones of the group that were with them kept pestering about details about the invasions, and some of the others had indulged them. But Paul was busy talking to someone else about something, and eventually changed the topic. However, just before he left for the night, after some of the others had brought out their drugs and started using, he overheard the blonde guy saying that he wanted to have a go at invasions, and they should hit the house of the big party that all the guys from the other town were in. That is, the house we were staying at. Paul panicked a bit and tried to call the house, but we missed the call. Fearing the worst since the guy was also leaving, he raced over, but not knowing the town very well and having a bit of car trouble, he was scared he'd be late. He said he didn't want to get his friends into trouble by calling the cops since drugs were involved. But he was also really worried because he was pretty sure the guy was showing a knife to some of the others. At that point, he finally arrived, making it in time to chase the three off the property. Apparently the day after, Paul went to talk to the cops about it, leaving some information out about the drugs, and some arrests were made at that point. But I don't know more beyond that. He said he finally felt enough guilt to talk to the cops about it after he realized that someone he knew personally could have been hurt, especially when it was someone whose family he owed a lot for helping him out. So yeah, in hindsight, we were pretty lucky that Paul was around to save our butts. Sadly, he's gone out of town again to attend another rehab clinic, as my brother convinced him to do so after he confessed to being on ice. But he did get a homemade chocolate cake out of the deal after I heard the truth. I was once in a car accident in which I was T-boned by a girl, not much older than I am, on my passenger side after she ran a stop sign when I was 18. For the record, it was very dark, and this sign was hidden around a bend with trees in the way. Immediately after the collision, I got out of my car, and it felt like I was being taken over by a higher power. The front of her car was completely totaled, and I approached her driver's side door and asked if she was okay, but she was completely unresponsive. Without hesitation, I told the guy at the stop sign behind me to call 911. I pulled her out of the car and immediately began chest compressions. To make things even more strange, I said, "Come on, Aaliyah, stay with us. Come on, Aaliyah," with every compression before the emergency services arrived and took over. Now, never in my life had I met this woman. Never have I believed in the paranormal. Until we went to the hospital, and the doctor came out smiling and thanked me for my efforts. They then said, "Aaliyah would like to thank you too," and guided me to her room. It has forever lived with me, and we actually became friends who go to the same university. I don't think I saved her life, and that it was instead her guardian angel really chokes me up. I'm not religious at all. I even have a lump in my throat just typing this up. I think I'm gonna have to text her. A few years ago, my sister was married to a soldier in the British Army, and he was stationed in Germany. We all visited her, and she knew I was interested in history. So, for a day out, we visited Belsen-Bergen, the former Nazi concentration camp. As we were walking around, my sister was pushing the stroller with my nephew in it. He was 1 or 2 years old at the time. The thing about Belsen-Bergen is that after the way it was burnt to the ground, it's more or less blank fields. As we walked, we passed a tree when my nephew asked my sister who the kids were behind us. We all turned around, and no one's there. My sister asked, "Which kids?" And he replied, "The ones in pajamas." Yet again, no kids to be seen anywhere. We all knew for a fact that he had no idea what country he was in, let alone know about the horrible events that had occurred in that camp. I would be reading or playing with my toys, and as all young children do, I began to reminisce about recent events and conversations. Then, as I remembered something specific that was said, I would literally hear a spoken word or two whispered directly into my ear. It would shock me because I knew I was alone. But what used to scare me was the black shadow man, who I would then notice standing there. The second my eyes tried to fixate on and rationalize what I was seeing, it would instantly disappear. He was always wearing a thin-brimmed hat. This all happened in South Florida. I never felt paralyzed, and every time I saw him, I was wide awake in broad daylight. I saw him when I was playing in the living room, and only at one particular house. It was unnerving. I was about 6 years old when our washer broke, and we had to go to the laundromat at a little shopping center to do our laundry for a while. I remember it was a warm June afternoon just before dusk, and I was sitting on the back of my mom's car eating some candy when I heard the roar of engines coming down the boulevard in front of me. I could see down the road. It was 2 vehicles, a white-colored Red Hot and a van racing at top speed side by side. As they neared the intersection where I was, the road rose ever so slightly, and they were going so fast. Both vehicles rose and collided in midair. The van kept going, but the car rolled twice as fast and flew into the air onto the third roll. And as the car rose, the guy's upper body came out of the window, and his head was chopped clean off. When the car landed, the really freaky part is the head rolled into the gutter about 6 feet directly in front of where I was sitting. I was getting ready to turn left onto the on-ramp for a highway around midnight one night when I watched someone on the off-ramp blow a red light in front of me and T-bone the person who I was waiting on. They were going the opposite direction as me, and I was waiting for them to clear the intersection before turning. The guy on the off-ramp absolutely creamed this sedan with their trunk. The person in the sedan had their head exploded, literally. It was splattered across the shattered remains of the windshield, and you could see what was left of them through the empty window. It was really bad. I floored it and left the intersection. It was horrifying, and I was probably 5 miles away before I pulled over and what happened sank in. I probably spent a few hours that night just sitting there in my truck, shaking. It still upsets me when I think about it. Coincidentally enough, I watched the episode of Game of Thrones with Tyrion's trial by combat only 3 days after this happened. I had to then explain to my girlfriend why I suddenly froze and started shaking again. Now, looking back, I rate the realism of that scene as 3 out of 10, having seen the real deal. Hey there. Hope you enjoyed these stories. If you can, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. See you next time.